The year was 1942, and deep within the walls of the Vichy French embassy in Washington, an American woman stood completely naked in the darkness. Her name was Betty Pack. She was 32 years old, and in that moment, with a flashlight beam cutting through the black and illuminating her bare skin, she was about to pull off one of the most daring espionage operations of World War II. But to understand how this Minnesota-born socialite ended up standing naked in a foreign embassy, while a safecracker worked behind her to steal Nazi-aligned military codes, we need to go back to the beginning. We need to understand who Betty Pack really was, and how an American debutante became one of the most effective spies the Allied forces ever deployed. Betty Pack was born Amy Elizabeth Thorpe on November 22, 1910, in Minneapolis, Minnesota. Her father was Major George Cyrus Thorpe, a United States Marine Corps officer, and her mother, Cora Wells, came from political stock. Her maternal grandfather served as a Minnesota state senator. This was not a family of modest means or quiet ambitions. From her earliest days, Betty grew up in a world of privilege, power, and constant movement. Her father's military career meant the family relocated frequently, bouncing from one posting to another. They lived in Guantanamo, Cuba, during the First World War. When Betty was still a young girl, this nomadic existence shaped her in ways that would prove critical to her future work. She learned early how to adapt, how to read new social situations quickly, and how to make connections in unfamiliar places. In 1923, after her father retired from active military service, the Thorpe family spent time in Europe, where Betty learned to speak French fluently. This was not classroom French. This was the real thing, learned by living among French speakers and absorbing the language naturally. The family eventually settled in Washington, D.C., where her father attended law school and established himself in legal practice. Young Betty was introduced to the capital's social scene, a glittering world of diplomatic receptions, embassy parties, and political gatherings. Her mother made certain that Betty moved through the upper circles of Washington society, meeting foreign diplomats, politicians, and influential figures. Betty was striking to look at. She had amber-colored hair that caught the light, emerald green eyes that seemed to sparkle with intelligence and mischief, and a laugh that people described as naughty and uninhibited. She was tall, slim, and carried herself with patrician confidence. But what really set Betty apart was not her appearance. It was her intelligence and her complete lack of interest in following conventional rules. At 14 years old, Betty had her first sexual encounter with a 21-year-old man in Newport, Rhode Island. This was 1924, and such behavior was scandalous, something that would have ruined most young women of her social class. But Betty did not seem to care about the potential consequences. By her late teens, she had been romantically involved with several foreign diplomats, men significantly older than herself. She was drawn to worldly powerful men who could tell her about international politics and the complex web of alliances and conflicts shaping the world. Sex, for Betty, was never just about physical pleasure. It was intertwined with curiosity, with power, and with her desire to understand how the world really worked behind the polite facades of diplomatic gatherings. In April 1930, at the age of 19, Betty found herself pregnant. The father's identity remains unclear even today. Multiple men could have been responsible, but one man stepped forward to marry her. Arthur Pack was a second secretary at the British Embassy in Washington. He was 38 years old, nearly twice Betty's age, a proper British diplomat concerned above all with appearances and career advancement. The marriage was arranged quickly to avoid scandal. Betty was pregnant on her wedding day. On October 2, 1930, she gave birth to a boy in England. Arthur insisted the child be placed with foster parents. Betty agreed. This was not a woman who had dreamed of motherhood and domestic life. The baby was handed over to a country doctor and his wife to raise, and Betty moved on with her life as a diplomat's wife. The marriage was a disaster from the start. Arthur Pack was cold, distant, and obsessed with propriety and his diplomatic career. Betty was restless, passionate, and bored to tears by the constraints of being a proper diplomatic spouse. But the marriage gave her something valuable. It gave her access. As the wife of a British diplomat, Betty could move freely through embassy circles across the world. She attended diplomatic functions, met foreign officials, and learned how to navigate the complex social dynamics of international politics. In 1931, Arthur was assigned to the British Embassy in Chile. Betty followed him to Santiago, where she threw herself into the role of diplomatic hostess. She learned Spanish fluently, made connections throughout Chilean society, and on January 31, 1934, gave birth to a daughter, Denise. But motherhood did nothing to settle Betty or strengthen her failing marriage. She continued to have affairs. She was learning how to extract information from her lovers, how to guide conversations toward useful topics, and how to remember details that might matter. In 1935, Arthur received a significant posting to Madrid, Spain. They arrived just as Spain was teetering on the edge of civil war. The country was divided between leftist Republicans and right-wing nationalists. Strikes paralyzed the economy. Violence erupted in the streets. When the Spanish Civil War finally exploded in July 1936, Madrid became a dangerous, chaotic war zone. Betty Pack found herself energized by the danger and the opportunities it presented. She became involved in covert activities, playing what she would later call her vagabond years. She had an affair with a Catholic priest, and when the Republican government began arresting clergy, Betty worked to secure his release. She made contact with the papal nuncio, the Vatican's diplomatic representative, and convinced him to intervene. It was a risky move that could have gotten her killed. But it worked. The priest was released, and Betty helped smuggle him across the border to safety. She did not stop there. Betty smuggled rebel nationalists out of Republican-controlled areas, transported Red Cross medical supplies to Franco's forces, and helped coordinate the naval evacuation of British embassy staff from northern Spain. She was working both sides, gathering information, making connections, and learning the tradecraft that would serve her so well in the years ahead. It was during this period that British intelligence in London began to take notice of this remarkable American woman, married to one of their diplomats. She was fearless, resourceful, and seemed to have a natural gift for the work. When Arthur Pack was reassigned to Warsaw, Poland in 1937, the British Secret Intelligence Service was watching Betty Pack very closely. Poland in 1938 was a powder keg. Nazi Germany had already annexed Austria in the Anschluss. Everyone with eyes could see that Czechoslovakia would be next. Poland shared a long border with Germany and had every reason to fear Hitler's expansionist ambitions. The Polish government was secretly collaborating with Germany on some matters, while simultaneously trying to prepare for the inevitable German invasion. It was a complex, dangerous political situation, and valuable intelligence was flowing through Warsaw's diplomatic circles. Arthur Pack suffered a stroke shortly after arriving in Warsaw. Betty took him back to England to recover, then returned to Poland with her daughter. She was effectively alone in Warsaw, a married woman whose husband was thousands of miles away, free to move through Polish society as she wished. Betty began an affair with a young Polish Foreign Service officer named Edward Kulikowski. He was passionate about politics and worried about Poland's future. In bed and in intimate conversations, Kulikowski shared his concerns with Betty. He told her that Hitler was planning to annex Czechoslovakia next, and that Poland was secretly working with Germany to take a piece of Czech territory for itself. Betty listened carefully, asked intelligent questions, and remembered everything. She then went to the British Embassy and shared what she had learned with Jack Shelley, the Secret Intelligence Service agent stationed in Warsaw. Shelley recognized immediately that Betty Pack had extraordinary potential as an intelligence asset. He recruited her formally into British intelligence. Her next target was Count Mikhail Lubienski, the chief aide to Poland's Foreign Minister Józef Beck. Lubienski was at the center of Polish foreign policy decisions. He had access to highly classified information about Poland's military preparations, its diplomatic communications, and its intelligence operations. Betty met him at a diplomatic reception and quickly began an affair with him. Lubienski fell for her completely. He was a cultured, bookish man who found in Betty a beautiful woman who could discuss politics and international affairs with real intelligence. He trusted her. He confided in her. And when they were alone together, Betty would carefully go through his briefcase, his suitcase, and any papers he had with him. She photographed documents, she memorized conversations, and then she would go home and type up detailed, meticulous reports that she sent to London through diplomatic pouches. Her reports were extraordinary. They were not dry intelligence summaries. They were vivid, detailed narratives that painted complete pictures of her sources, their concerns, their motivations, and the information they possessed. Betty had a gift for psychological analysis. She understood what made people tick, what they feared, what they desired. She could predict how they would react to different situations. The men in London who read her reports were captivated. They eagerly awaited each new installment, and Betty delivered information that proved incredibly valuable to British intelligence operations. The most significant intelligence she obtained from Lubienski concerned the German Enigma machine. The Poles had been working on cracking the Enigma cipher, the supposedly unbreakable code system that the Germans used for their military communications. Polish mathematicians and cryptographers had made remarkable progress. They had actually succeeded in breaking the Enigma code and building their own replica machines. When Betty learned about this breakthrough from Lubienski, she immediately reported it to London. The British convinced the Polish government to share their Enigma research with Britain. This intelligence proved absolutely crucial. When war broke out and the Germans introduced more sophisticated versions of the Enigma machine, the groundwork laid by Polish cryptographers and shared through Betty's intelligence work gave Alan Turing and the codebreakers at Bletchley Park the foundation they needed to crack the new German codes. Without this head start, it is quite possible that British codebreakers would never have broken Enigma at all. And without breaking Enigma, the Allies would have fought World War II effectively blind, unable to read German military communications. The impact on the war's outcome would have been catastrophic. But Betty's espionage activities in Poland could not remain secret forever. The Polish foreign minister learned that Count Lubienski had been indiscreet with the American wife of a British diplomat on September 27, 1938. Betty was ordered to leave Poland immediately. She packed her belongings and departed. Her cover was blown. Her network was compromised. But the intelligence she had provided was already in London's hands, and it would prove invaluable in the years ahead. Arthur Pack, meanwhile, was in Canada recovering from his stroke. His career was effectively over. In April 1939, he was given a reduced posting to Santiago, Chile. Betty rejoined him there, but the marriage was beyond repair. Arthur was having an affair with another woman. Betty was already thinking about her next move. When Germany invaded Poland on September 1, 1939, starting World War II, Betty Pack was enraged. She had lived in Poland. She had friends there. She had seen firsthand the threat that Nazi Germany represented. And she was in Chile, a country where pro-Axis sentiment was strong, and the government was sympathetic to Hitler and Mussolini. Betty could not sit idle. Using the pen name Elizabeth Thomas, she began writing a column in Spanish for the Chilean newspaper La Nación. Her articles were inflammatory, passionately pro-Allied propaganda, attacking fascism, and warning about the Nazi threat. She poured her fury and her commitment into these pieces. The German embassy in Chile quickly figured out who Elizabeth Thomas really was. They complained to the British embassy. The situation became untenable. To save face for the British diplomatic mission, Betty decided to leave Chile, but she had no intention of retiring to quiet domesticity. In August 1940, she wrote a letter to her husband confessing her numerous affairs and suggesting he divorce her to save his career. Then she contacted British intelligence in London and told them she was available for operational work. She flew to New York to meet with her handlers. British security coordination, the intelligence organization run by Canadian spy master William Stevenson from offices in New York, gave her the codenamed Cynthia. She was 30 years old, experienced, fearless, and ready to go to work, and the British had the perfect mission for her. Stevenson wanted Cynthia to establish herself in Washington, D.C. and begin targeting foreign embassies. She rented a house at 3327 O Street, posing as a journalist. The house had a secret back exit that she could use when entertaining visitors who needed to come and go discreetly. She threw parties, attended diplomatic receptions, and quickly re-established herself in Washington's social circles. Her first major target was Admiral Alberto Lais, the Italian naval attaché in Washington. Betty had actually met Lais years earlier when she was a teenager in Washington. Now she renewed their acquaintance. Lais was charming, cultured, and married. He was also a fascist serving Mussolini's government. Betty seduced him. She became his mistress. And in the intimate moments they shared, Lais talked about his work, his concerns, and his orders. In March 1941, Betty learned from Lais that the Italian government had ordered all Italian merchant ships in American ports to be sabotaged. If war broke out between the United States and Italy, the ships were to be scuttled or disabled to prevent American forces from seizing them. Betty immediately passed this intelligence to her British handlers, who shared it with American authorities. When the United States entered the war in December 1941, American officials moved to seize the Italian ships. Most of the 27 Italian vessels in American ports were already sabotaged by their crews, as Lais had predicted. But several ships were saved because authorities acted on Betty's intelligence. These ships were then used by the American military. The intelligence Betty obtained from Lais had another significant impact. She also managed to steal or copy the Italian naval cipher codes. These codes allowed British cryptographers to read Italian naval communications. In March 1941, the Royal Navy faced the Italian fleet in the Battle of Cape Matapan off the coast of Greece. The British had a significant tactical advantage because they could read Italian communications thanks to the codes Betty Pack had obtained. The British destroyed or severely damaged 3 Italian heavy cruisers and 2 destroyers, killing over 2,400 Italian sailors. The Italian fleet suffered a devastating defeat and never really recovered. Admiral Lais, Betty's lover, was the source of the intelligence that led to this British victory. He never knew it. Betty had used him perfectly, extracting exactly what she needed without arousing his suspicions. But British intelligence had a much bigger target in mind for Cynthia. In June 1940, France had fallen to the Nazis. The French government had signed an armistice with Germany, and a collaborationist French state had been established in the town of Vichy in southern France. The Vichy regime was supposedly neutral, but in practice it functioned as a Nazi puppet government. Vichy controlled France's colonial possessions in North Africa and maintained diplomatic missions around the world, including a large embassy in Washington, D.C. The Vichy embassy was a hive of pro-Nazi activity. The ambassador Gaston-Henri Hay was reporting to Pierre Laval, the Vichy prime minister who openly collaborated with Hitler. The embassy was gathering intelligence on British and American military preparations and passing it to Vichy, which shared it with the Germans. The British and Americans knew this was happening, but they needed proof. More importantly, they needed something specific. They needed the Vichy naval cipher codes. The French Navy was substantial. Vichy controlled dozens of warships, including battleships, aircraft carriers, cruisers, and submarines. These ships were concentrated in North African ports like Casablanca, Oran, and Dakar. The British had already attacked the French fleet at Mers el-Kabir in July 1940 to prevent the ships from falling into German hands, killing nearly 1,300 French sailors and creating enormous bitterness between Britain and Vichy France. But Vichy still controlled significant naval forces, and the Allies were planning operations in North Africa. They needed to know where the French ships were, what orders they had received, and what the Vichy military command was planning. To get this information, they needed to break the Vichy naval codes. And to break the codes, they needed to steal the codebooks from the Vichy embassy in Washington. This was an almost impossible assignment. The Vichy embassy was heavily guarded. Armed security personnel watched the entrances. The building had steel doors and sophisticated locks. The codebooks were kept in a safe in a secure room, and only the chief cipher officer and his assistant had access to that room. The combination to the safe was known to only a few people. Getting into the embassy undetected, opening the safe, removing the codebooks, photographing them, and returning them before anyone noticed they were missing would require exceptional planning, nerves of steel, and a significant element of luck. In March 1942, Cynthia was called to New York for urgent meetings with both her British and American handlers. She was now working jointly for British intelligence and the newly formed Office of Strategic Services, the American spy organization that would later become the CIA. Both organizations wanted the Vichy codes desperately. Allied planners were preparing Operation Torch, the invasion of North Africa, scheduled for November 1942. The Vichy codes could mean the difference between success and catastrophic failure. Thousands of Allied lives hung in the balance. Cynthia listened to the assignment. She understood the stakes, and according to her memoirs, which are now archived at Churchill College, Cambridge, she made a bold announcement to her handlers. "I can," she said, "and I will." But even as she spoke those confident words, Betty Pack knew this operation would be unlike anything she had attempted before. She would need help from the inside. She would need someone working at the Vichy embassy who could provide access to the building and information about security procedures. She would need time to cultivate this source and turn him to the Allied cause. And she would need to come up with a credible reason for being inside the embassy late at night when the safe could be cracked. Betty returned to Washington and began planning her approach. She posed as a pro-Vichy American journalist and requested an interview with Ambassador Henry Hay. She called the embassy to set up the appointment. The embassy's press attaché, a man named Charles Brousse, took her call. They arranged to meet before her interview with the ambassador. When Betty walked into Charles Brousse's office for the first time, she knew immediately that she had found her inside man. Charles Emmanuel Brousse was 49 years old. Though he looked younger, he had been a fighter pilot in World War I, flying dangerous missions over the Western Front. After the war, he had become a journalist and eventually co-owned an influential chain of newspapers in southern France. He was debonair, cultured, a connoisseur of fine food and wine. He had been married somewhere between 3 and 6 times. Even British intelligence files were unclear on the exact count. He had a mischievous, rakish smile and a reputation as a charmer. But Charles Brousse was also deeply disillusioned with the Vichy regime. Brousse had watched France fall to the Nazis. He had seen Pierre Laval collaborate openly with Hitler. He despised what Vichy represented. He believed France's honor and future were being destroyed by collaboration with Germany. But he kept these views largely to himself because he needed his job. He was working as the press attaché at the Vichy embassy in Washington, a relatively minor position that paid him a modest salary. He had a wife back in France, though the marriage was troubled. When Betty Pack sat across from Charles Brousse for their first meeting, she was, by her own account, in her most sparkling mood. She was charming, witty, and intelligent. She asked insightful questions about France and the war. She flirted just enough to make her interest clear, without being obvious. Brousse was captivated. Before the meeting ended, there was an undeniable attraction between them. They agreed to meet again, ostensibly to discuss her article. But both of them knew what was really happening. Within weeks, Charles Brousse and Betty Pack were lovers. They would meet at Betty's house on O Street, where they could be alone and undisturbed. Their affair was passionate and intense, but for Betty, this was not simply about attraction or pleasure. She was running Brousse as an intelligence asset, carefully cultivating him and preparing him for what she would eventually ask him to do. She listened to his complaints about Pierre Laval and the Vichy government. She encouraged his doubts about collaboration with Germany. She presented herself as an American, who sympathized with Free France and Charles de Gaulle's resistance movement, and slowly, carefully, she began to probe for information about the embassy, its security procedures, and the people who worked there. In July 1941, just 2 months into their affair, the Vichy embassy eliminated Brousse's position. He was told he could accept a transfer back to France at a much lower salary, or he could stay in Washington in a minor administrative role at half his current pay. Brousse was bitter and angry. His career was being destroyed. His salary would barely cover his expenses. Betty saw her opportunity. She confided in Brousse that she was not simply a journalist. She was working for American intelligence. She was not British, she carefully emphasized, knowing that Brousse harbored resentment toward Britain for the attack at Mers el-Kebir. She was American, and she could pay him for information. She appealed to his patriotism, arguing that helping the Allies was the best way to free France from German occupation. Brousse listened, he thought, about it, and then he agreed. From July 1941 onward, Charles Brousse provided Cynthia with a steady stream of classified information from the Vichy embassy. He brought her copies of telegrams sent between Washington and Vichy. He shared details about Ambassador Henry Hay's activities and communications. He provided intelligence about Vichy agents operating in the United States and their contacts with pro-Nazi sympathizers. The information exposed what British and American intelligence had long suspected. The Vichy embassy was functioning as an intelligence collection center for Germany. Henry Hay was sending detailed reports to Admiral Jean-François Darlan in Vichy about British warships docked in American ports for repairs, their damage assessments, and when they would return to service. This intelligence was being passed directly to the Germans, who could then target these ships. Brousse's information confirmed that the Vichy embassy posed a serious security threat to Allied operations. But in March 1942, when Betty was given the assignment to steal the Vichy naval codes, she knew this would be a much harder sell. She needed Brousse to help her break into the embassy, crack the safe, and steal the most sensitive documents in the entire building. If they were caught, Brousse would face charges of treason. He could be executed. Betty flew back to Washington from her New York meeting and went to Brousse. She told him what she needed. Brousse's reaction was immediate and negative. He refused. The risk was too great. Breaking into the cipher room and stealing the code books would be impossible. They would certainly be caught. He would not do it. Betty did not give up. She appealed to his love for France. She told him the codes could help the Allies liberate North Africa from Vichy control and ultimately free all of France from Nazi occupation. She made the stakes clear. This was not about abstract intelligence. This was about winning the war and saving France. But Brousse still hesitated. Finally, Betty played her trump card. She told Brousse that if he would not help her, she would find someone else who would, or she would work alone. "There's a war going on," she told him, "and if you, who swear you love me, will not help me, then I will either work alone or with someone else who will help me." It was a calculated emotional manipulation. Betty was threatening to end their relationship or to put herself in terrible danger without him. Brousse could not bear either prospect. He finally, reluctantly agreed to help, but he made clear he had no idea how they could possibly succeed. Betty and Brousse began planning the operation carefully. They needed to establish a credible reason for being inside the embassy late at night, when the building would be largely empty. Brousse came up with a solution that was both brilliant and audacious. He told embassy officials that he needed a place to conduct an affair in secret. His wife was in France, but he had to be discreet because any scandal could cost him his position. The embassy, he explained, would be the perfect location. It was familiar to him. It was secure, and it would be empty at night. Remarkably, embassy officials agreed. They gave Brousse permission to use the embassy for his romantic trysts. The night guard was instructed to let Brousse and his companion enter the building, and to leave them undisturbed. The guard's name was Joseph. Brousse and Betty began visiting the embassy several nights a week, arriving after dark and leaving before dawn. They made sure Joseph, the night guard, heard them making love. They were loud, passionate, and obvious about what they were doing. They wanted Joseph to have no doubts about why they were there. The noise echoed through the empty hallways. Joseph, who was an older man and something of a romantic, believed he was helping two lovers find privacy for their affair. He would greet them when they arrived, let them into the building, and then deliberately stay away from the area where they were meeting, giving them privacy. This pattern continued for weeks. Betty and Brousse were establishing their cover story and making it completely believable. During these visits, Brousse showed Betty the layout of the embassy. They located the cipher room where the safe was kept. They noted the security procedures. They observed Joseph's routine as he made his rounds through the building. They learned that Joseph had a guard dog, a large, aggressive German shepherd named Yuki, that accompanied him on his patrols. The dog was a problem. Dogs could not be fooled or bribed. They would need to deal with the dog somehow. Betty began bringing treats for Yuki. When they visited the embassy, she made friends with the dog, petting him and feeding him. Over several weeks, Yuki came to accept Betty and no longer barked at her when she entered the building. This small detail would prove crucial. While Betty and Brousse were establishing their cover at the embassy, British and American intelligence were arranging their end of the operation. They recruited a professional safecracker, a Canadian criminal they called the Georgia Cracker, because he had been serving time in a Georgia prison when the OSS recruited him. The Georgia Cracker was an expert at opening safes without leaving any evidence of tampering. He would be the one to actually crack the safe and extract the code books. But first, he needed to learn the safe's location, type, and any specific security features. Brousse managed to get close enough to the cipher room to observe the safe during daytime when embassy staff were working. He reported that it was a heavy, sophisticated model with a combination lock. The Georgia Cracker studied the intelligence and prepared his tools. The first attempt to steal the codes took place in early June 1942. Brousse and Betty entered the embassy as usual. Joseph let them in and went about his rounds. Once they were certain Joseph was far enough away, they signaled the Georgia Cracker, who entered through a window. But there was a problem. The safe proved more difficult to crack than anticipated. The Georgia Cracker worked quietly, his ear pressed to the safe, listening for the subtle clicks of the tumblers as he turned the dial, but he could not find the combination. Hours passed. Dawn was approaching. They had to abort. The Georgia Cracker left through the window, and Brousse and Betty pretended they had simply spent another passionate night together. Joseph never knew anything unusual had happened. They tried again a few nights later. Same procedure, same result. The Georgia Cracker worked on the safe for hours, but could not open it. They had to abort again. Time was running short. Allied planners needed the codes for Operation Torch. Invasion preparations were moving forward. If they could not get the codes soon, the opportunity would pass. Betty and Brousse began to worry that Joseph was becoming suspicious. He had not said anything directly, but there were subtle changes in his behavior. He seemed more alert, more watchful. They decided to try a different approach. They would drug Joseph's dog and potentially Joseph himself, giving the Georgia Cracker more time to work uninterrupted. On their next visit, Betty brought champagne. She suggested that Joseph join them in a toast. Joseph was pleased by the gesture. He came to Brousse's office, and they shared several glasses of champagne. Betty made sure Joseph's glass was always full. The champagne had been doctored with sleeping pills, though not enough to knock Joseph out completely, just enough to make him drowsy and less alert. They also gave Yuki the dog champagne in his water bowl, also drugged. Within an hour, Joseph was noticeably sleepy. He yawned repeatedly and told them he needed to rest for a bit. He retired to his basement office. Yuki curled up beside his water bowl and fell asleep. The Georgia Cracker was signaled to enter. He went to work on the safe again, this time with more time and less fear of interruption. But once again, the safe resisted his efforts. He could not find the combination. After several hours of work, he had to admit defeat. The group met afterward to assess what had gone wrong. The Georgia Cracker explained that this particular safe was exceptionally well made. The tumblers were precise. The tolerances were tight. He needed more time, absolute silence, and no risk of interruption. They decided to make one final attempt, but this time they would need a backup plan in case Joseph came by during the safecracking. The final attempt was scheduled for June 19, 1942. The date was chosen deliberately. Prime Minister Winston Churchill was arriving in Washington that day for high-level conferences with President Franklin Roosevelt. Security forces would be focused on protecting Churchill and managing the diplomatic meetings. The Vichy embassy would likely have reduced vigilance during this period. Brousse and Betty arrived at the embassy as usual. Joseph greeted them. This time, they did not drug Joseph. They needed him alert enough to make his rounds so that his behavior would seem normal if anyone checked on him. The plan was risky. If Joseph made his rounds and heard the safecracker at work, or if he simply became suspicious and decided to investigate, the entire operation would collapse. Betty and Brousse began their usual performance of making love loudly enough for Joseph to hear. They wanted him to believe this was just another night, like all the others. After about an hour, they signaled the Georgia cracker. He climbed through the window and made his way to the cipher room. He began working on the safe. Betty and Brousse waited tensely. The minutes crawled past. An hour, 2 hours. Then they heard Joseph's footsteps. He was making his rounds. He was coming toward Brousse's office. There was no time to warn the Georgia cracker or to stop Joseph. Betty made a split-second decision. She tore off her clothes. Every stitch. She stood completely naked in the darkness of the office. Brousse, following her lead, also stripped. They embraced, making it look like they had been caught in an intimate moment. Joseph opened the door. His flashlight swept the room, and the beam caught Betty standing there, naked, making only a half-hearted attempt to cover herself with her hands. She gave Joseph a long, deliberate look at her body. She wanted him to be so shocked and embarrassed by what he saw that he would immediately leave and would not investigate any further noises he might hear. "Oh, la," Betty said in a playful voice, as if she were more amused than embarrassed. Joseph stammered an apology. "I beg your pardon 1,000 times, madam," he muttered, thoroughly flustered. He quickly shut off his flashlight and retreated, closing the door firmly behind him. He hurried away, his face burning with embarrassment. Betty waited a moment, then whispered to Brousse, "There was method in my madness." They listened carefully. Joseph's footsteps faded into the distance. He was going back to his post, mortified by what he had seen and determined not to disturb the lovers again. Betty and Brousse quickly got dressed and went to check on the Georgia cracker. He was still working on the safe. The encounter with Joseph had been close, but the safecracker had not been discovered. Another hour passed. Then another. Finally, near dawn, there was a soft click. The Georgia cracker had found the combination. The safe door swung open. Inside were the Vichy naval code books, exactly what they had come for. The Georgia cracker removed the code books carefully, handling them as little as possible to avoid leaving fingerprints. He passed them out through the window to an OSS agent waiting outside in a car. The agent rushed the codebooks to a nearby location, where they were photographed, page by page, under bright lights. The work took several hours. Every page, every cipher table, every code group was captured on film. Meanwhile, Betty and Brousse waited in the embassy. They could not leave until the codebooks were returned. If the codebooks were found missing when the cipher staff arrived for work in a few hours, the theft would be discovered immediately. The embassy would be locked down. Everyone who had been in the building that night would be questioned. The entire operation would be exposed. So they waited, maintaining their cover story in case anyone saw them. Finally, as dawn was breaking, the codebooks were returned through the window. The Georgia cracker carefully placed them back in the safe exactly as he had found them. He closed the safe door, spun the dial to lock it, and made sure everything looked undisturbed. Then he slipped out through the window and disappeared into the early morning light. Betty and Brousse made sure the office looked normal. Then they left the embassy, waving goodbye to Joseph and thanking him for his discretion. They had done it. They had pulled off one of the most daring espionage operations of World War II. The photographs of the Vichy codebooks were rushed to British and American cryptographers. Within days, Allied intelligence could read every coded message sent by the Vichy military and naval commands. They knew where French warships were stationed. They knew what orders had been given to Vichy commanders in North Africa. They knew about German movements and plans being communicated through Vichy channels. This intelligence proved absolutely crucial for Operation Torch, the Allied invasion of North Africa in November 1942. American and British forces landed in Morocco and Algeria, overwhelming Vichy resistance. The Vichy naval forces, whose positions and orders were known in advance, thanks to the stolen codes, were neutralized. The operation was a success, establishing Allied control over North Africa and providing a launching point for the invasion of Italy in 1943. Ellery Huntington, who headed OSS Special Operations for Operation Torch, later said that Cynthia's work had changed the course of the war. Sir William Stephenson, head of British Security Coordination and Cynthia's ultimate superior, called her the greatest unsung heroine of the war. The intelligence she provided saved thousands of Allied lives and shortened the war by months, if not years. But Betty Pack's career as a spy did not end with the Vichy embassy operation. She continued working for British intelligence and the OSS throughout 1942 and into 1943. However, her cover was eventually blown in a dramatic and unfortunate way. Charles Brousse's wife Catherine had grown suspicious of her husband's frequent absences and his obvious involvement with another woman. She confronted them. There was a scene. Catherine Brousse screamed that Betty was an American spy, and she screamed loud enough that others heard. Betty's identity as an intelligence operative was now public knowledge, at least within certain circles. Her operational career was over. You cannot work as a covert agent once your cover is completely blown. British intelligence considered sending her into occupied France to work with resistance networks, but decided against it. She was too well known in intelligence circles by this point. The Germans had files on her. Her face was recognizable. She would be captured almost immediately. So Betty Pack, the woman who had seduced Italian and Vichy French officials, who had stolen cipher codes that changed the course of the war, who had stood naked in a foreign embassy to protect a safecracker, was retired from active espionage at the age of 33. She had been operational for just 3 years, from 1940 to 1943, but in that short time she had accomplished more than most intelligence officers achieve in entire careers. After the war ended in 1945, Betty and Charles Brousse finally had a chance to be together openly. Arthur Pack, Betty's estranged husband, committed suicide in 1945. The reasons are not entirely clear, but his diplomatic career had been destroyed, his health was poor, and his marriage had been a public failure. Charles Brousse divorced his wife Catherine. In 1945, Betty Pack and Charles Brousse were finally free to marry. They wed quietly and moved to France, settling in the Château de Castelnau, a medieval castle in the Pyrenees Orientales region of southern France, near the Spanish border. The castle dated back to 990 AD and had survived sieges, crusades, wars, and the passage of 1,000 years of history. It was remote, beautiful, and peaceful. Betty and Charles lived there together. Far from the world of espionage and international intrigue, they tried to build a quiet life. Charles managed his newspaper interests. Betty tried to settle into the role of a French chatelaine, managing the castle and its grounds. But the war had changed both of them in ways they could not escape. Charles had betrayed his own government, even if that government had been a Nazi puppet regime. He had risked execution for treason. The psychological toll was significant. Betty had spent 3 years using seduction as a weapon, sleeping with men she did not love to extract secrets that would get people killed. She had lived in constant danger, always one mistake away from exposure and imprisonment or death. That kind of life leaves marks that cannot be erased. In her later years, Betty began to write a memoir. She wanted to tell her story, to explain what she had done and why. The British government did not want her memoir published. Too many secrets were still classified. Too many people were still alive who might be embarrassed or endangered by revelations about wartime intelligence operations. But Betty persisted. She wrote in fits and starts, trying to capture the intensity and importance of those wartime years. One passage from her memoirs survives and has been widely quoted. "They were the happiest days of my life." She wrote about her time as an operative. They were packed with all sorts of emotions: the supreme desire to help the Allied war effort, anxiety lest I fail in the responsibilities entrusted to me, lonely despair when my moves went wrong, satisfaction when things took a constructive form, and in the end it is with me still the real anguish of wondering if, with more experience and better judgment, I could not have worked faster and done more. That final thought is revealing and heartbreaking. Even years after the war ended, even living peacefully in a French castle with the man she loved, Betty Pack was still haunted by the question of whether she could have done more. Could she have obtained more intelligence? Could she have worked faster? Could she have saved more lives? It was the burden carried by everyone who fought in that war. The knowledge that so much had been at stake, and the constant second-guessing of every decision. Betty Pack was also a heavy smoker, and that habit eventually caught up with her. She developed cancer of the jaw and throat. The disease progressed quickly and painfully. Betty Pack died on December 1, 1963, at the age of 53. She was buried by special dispensation of the French government in the grounds of the Château de Castelnau, under a cedar tree she had loved. It was an unusual honor. French law typically required burial in consecrated cemeteries, but the government recognized her service to France during the war and allowed her to rest in the place she had called home. When Betty Pack died, Time magazine published an obituary that quoted Sir William Stevenson's assessment of her as the greatest unsung heroine of the war. But the full story of her exploits remained classified. The details of the Vichy embassy operation were not publicly revealed until the 1960s, when British intelligence officer H. Montgomery Hyde published a biography of Betty Pack titled Cynthia, based in part on her incomplete memoirs and unclassified files he had access to through his own intelligence work. The book caused a sensation. Many people were shocked to learn that the United States and Britain had employed a female spy who used seduction as an intelligence-gathering technique. There was controversy about whether such methods were ethical or appropriate. Betty Pack had anticipated these criticisms. When asked by Hyde whether she was ashamed of the method she used, she responded emphatically, "Not in the least. My superiors told me that the results of my work saved thousands of British and American lives. It involved me in situations from which respectable women draw back, but mine was total commitment. Wars are not won by respectable methods." That statement captures something essential about Betty Pack and about the nature of espionage itself. Intelligence work is not clean or comfortable. It requires deception, manipulation, and the willingness to do things that peacetime morality condemns. Betty Pack understood this completely. She never pretended to be a conventional moral exemplar. She knew she had crossed lines that most people would not cross. But she believed absolutely in the cause she served. She had seen fascism and Nazism up close in Spain and Poland. She knew what Hitler represented. She understood that the war against Nazi Germany was an existential struggle, not just between nations but between fundamentally different visions of human civilization. In that context, she believed that using her beauty and sexuality to extract secrets from enemy officials was not just justified but necessary. The question of whether Betty Pack should be celebrated or condemned is one that historians and ethicists still debate. Some argue that she was a patriot who made extraordinary sacrifices for her country and for the Allied cause. Others argue that she was manipulative and that her methods degraded both herself and the men she exploited. Both perspectives have validity. But what cannot be debated is the effectiveness of her work and its impact on the war. The intelligence Betty Pack provided was crucial. The Enigma information from Poland gave British codebreakers the foundation they needed to crack German military communications. The Italian naval codes she obtained helped the Royal Navy win the Battle of Cape Matapan. The Vichy codes she stole enabled the success of Operation Torch and the liberation of North Africa. These were not minor contributions. These were intelligence coups that directly affected major military operations and saved thousands of lives. Betty Pack's son from her first marriage, Anthony, was raised by foster parents in England. He eventually learned who his mother was and what she had done during the war. He served in the British military and was killed in action during the Korean War in the early 1950s. Betty was devastated by his death. She had given him up as an infant, had barely known him, and now he was gone. It was one more way the war and the choices she had made continued to haunt her. Her daughter Denise survived and maintained some contact with her mother, though their relationship was apparently not close. Charles Brousse outlived Betty by 9 years. He died in 1972 in a fire at the Château de Castelnau. The circumstances of the fire are not well documented, but he was 82 years old when he died. The castle that had sheltered their post-war life together was damaged but not destroyed. It still stands today, a tourist attraction and historical monument. The full story of Betty Pack's intelligence work may never be completely known. Many British and American intelligence files from World War II remain classified even today. Some files were deliberately destroyed after the war to protect sources and methods. Other files have been heavily redacted, with sensitive information blacked out. What we know about Betty Pack comes from declassified documents, from the Boy Boo memoirs she began but never finished, from the accounts of her intelligence handlers and colleagues, and from books written by historians who have pieced together her story from fragmentary evidence. But even with incomplete information, a clear picture emerges of a remarkable, complex, and controversial woman who played a significant role in one of history's most consequential conflicts. Betty Pack was a product of her time and her circumstances. She was born into privilege and raised in a world where women were expected to be decorative, obedient, and conventional. She rejected all of those expectations. She was sexually liberated at a time when female sexuality was strictly controlled and policed. She was intellectually curious and politically engaged at a time when women were largely excluded from serious political discussions. She was ambitious and adventurous at a time when women's ambitions were supposed to be limited to marriage and motherhood. In another era, with different opportunities available, Betty Pack might have been a diplomat herself, or a foreign correspondent, or an academic specializing in international relations. But those careers were largely closed to women in the 1930s and 1940s. Espionage offered her one of the few paths available to use her talents and to participate directly in the great events of her time. The fact that she used her sexuality as an intelligence tool was not incidental to her story, but central to it. Male spies rarely faced the same expectations or opportunities. Men could gather intelligence through official channels, through professional networks, through overt and covert means that did not require sexual intimacy. Women in the intelligence services faced a different calculus. Their access to powerful men was often mediated through their attractiveness and their willingness to use that attractiveness. This was a reflection of broader gender dynamics in society. Men had power. Women accessed that power through relationships with powerful men. Betty Pack understood these dynamics and exploited them brilliantly. She was not naive about what she was doing. She was ruthlessly practical. If men would give her vital intelligence in exchange for sex, she would provide the sex and take the intelligence. She saw it as a transaction, a means to an end, and the end was defeating Nazi Germany and fascism. Whether this pragmatic approach was empowering or degrading is a question that has no simple answer. Betty Pack herself clearly believed she was empowered by her intelligence work. She felt she had agency, purpose, and influence. She was making decisions that affected the course of the war. She was not a passive victim or a mere instrument of male desires. She was an active agent, manipulating her targets as much as they thought they were using her. But there was also a cost. The memoirs she began writing late in life suggest a woman grappling with complicated emotions about her wartime experiences. The happiness she described was real, but so was the anguish and the doubt. She had crossed moral and emotional boundaries that left permanent marks. She had used people and been used. She had lied constantly to her targets, to her husband, to nearly everyone in her life. That kind of sustained deception takes a psychological toll. After the war, Betty and Charles tried to live quietly and recover some sense of normalcy. But they were both damaged by their wartime experiences. Charles had committed treason against his own country, even if that country was the Vichy puppet regime. He had stolen state secrets and handed them to foreign intelligence services. He had done so because he believed it was the right thing to do, because he wanted to see France liberated from Nazi control. But that did not erase the fact that he had violated the most fundamental obligation of a government employee. He could never return to his newspaper career or to public life in France. He and Betty lived in relative isolation at the chateau, removed from the worlds they had once moved through with such ease. The question of Betty Pack's legacy remains complicated and contested. She received no public recognition during her lifetime beyond the Time magazine obituary. The United States government never officially acknowledged her service. She received no medals, no awards, no honors. This was partly because her work was classified and partly because there was discomfort with the methods she had employed. A woman who used sex as an intelligence tool did not fit easily into narratives of wartime heroism. She was too controversial, too morally ambiguous, too difficult to celebrate without raising uncomfortable questions. But in recent decades, as more information about World War II intelligence operations has been declassified, Betty Pack's story has received more attention. Books have been written about her. Historical societies and intelligence museums have recognized her contributions. Scholars have argued that she should be remembered alongside other great spies of World War II like Virginia Hall, who worked for the OSS in occupied France and became known as the Limping Lady after she lost part of her leg in an accident. Hall was celebrated because her work involved organizing resistance networks, sabotaging German operations, and gathering military intelligence through traditional espionage methods. Her story fit more comfortably into conventional narratives of wartime heroism. Betty Pack's story was messier, more sexually charged, harder to package as straightforward patriotism. But both women were patriots who took enormous risks to serve their countries in the Allied cause. Both were intelligent, brave, and resourceful. Both operated in dangerous environments where a single mistake could mean capture, torture, and death. The fact that their methods differed reflects the different opportunities and constraints they faced. Betty Pack used the tools available to her, which included her beauty, her charm, and her willingness to form intimate relationships with enemy officials. She was extraordinarily effective at what she did. The intelligence she provided had demonstrable, significant impacts on Allied operations. Her contribution to the war effort was substantial and should be recognized as such, regardless of anyone's personal comfort with her methods. The story of Betty Pack also illuminates broader questions about women's roles in wartime and in intelligence work. Women served in countless capacities during World War II. They worked in factories producing war materials. They served in military auxiliary services. They worked as nurses and doctors treating wounded soldiers. They worked in code-breaking operations at places like Bletchley Park, and some, like Betty Pack and Virginia Hall, worked in operational intelligence, gathering information behind enemy lines or from enemy officials. These women's contributions were essential to the Allied victory, yet their stories have often been marginalized or forgotten in official histories that focus primarily on male soldiers and male commanders. Betty Pack's story was particularly easy to marginalize because of its sexual nature. It was easier to simply not talk about her than to grapple with the ethical and moral complexities her work raised. But in doing so, we lose important historical information and we perpetuate a sanitized, incomplete understanding of how intelligence work actually functions. Real intelligence operations are morally ambiguous, ethically complicated, and often unpleasant. They involve deception, manipulation, and the exploitation of human weaknesses. They require people willing to do things that peacetime morality condemns. Betty Pack was willing to do those things. She paid a psychological price for that willingness, but she also helped win a war against genuine evil. The Nazi regime represented an existential threat not just to particular nations, but to fundamental human values and to civilization itself. The systematic murder of 6 million Jews in the Holocaust, the genocidal policies towards Slavic peoples, the aggressive wars of conquest, the totalitarian suppression of all dissent, the glorification of violence and racial hatred, all of these made Nazi Germany a regime that had to be defeated by any means necessary. In that context, Betty Pack's decision to use seduction as an intelligence-gathering tool seems not just justifiable, but perhaps even obvious. If sleeping with enemy officials could obtain information that would help defeat the Nazis and save Allied lives, then that was a price worth paying. Betty Pack understood this calculation and made her choice. She never expressed regret about her decision to become a spy or about the methods she employed. Her only regret, expressed in her memoirs, was that she might not have done enough, that perhaps she could have worked faster or obtained more intelligence. Today, nearly 60 years after Betty Pack's death, her story continues to fascinate and provoke debate. She has been the subject of books, articles, theatrical productions, and documentaries. She has been compared to Mata Hari, the Dutch exotic dancer and courtesan who worked as a spy during World War I and was executed by the French in 1917. But the comparison is not entirely accurate. Mata Hari's espionage work was relatively minor and her contributions to either side in World War I were negligible. She was more famous for her persona and her trial than for any actual intelligence she provided. Betty Pack, by contrast, was a highly effective intelligence operative whose work had real measurable impacts on military operations. The comparison diminishes her actual achievements by focusing on the sexual aspects of her work, rather than on her intelligence-gathering skills, her psychological acumen, and her operational successes. A more apt comparison might be to other World War II operatives who used unconventional methods to gather intelligence. Christina Skarbek, known as Christine Granville, was a Polish-born agent who worked for British intelligence and used both charm and threats to gather information and rescue Allied agents from German capture. Nancy Wake, the New Zealand-born resistance fighter known as the White Mouse, led armed raids against German positions and gathered intelligence through her resistance networks. These women, like Betty Pack, operated outside the conventional rules of warfare and used whatever methods worked to achieve their objectives. They were not soldiers in the traditional sense. They were operatives, using deception, courage, and ingenuity to gather information and disrupt enemy operations. Betty Pack's specific methods involved seduction, but the broader principle was the same as that employed by all intelligence operatives to exploit opportunities and human weaknesses to obtain information. The chateau where Betty Pack spent her final years still stands in the village of Castelnau in southwestern France. It is open to tourists who can walk through its medieval halls and climb its ancient towers. Most visitors have no idea that one of World War II's most effective spies lived there and is buried on the grounds. There is no plaque or memorial acknowledging her presence. The French government allowed her burial there as a quiet gesture of respect, but there has been no public celebration or official recognition of her service. This reflects the enduring ambivalence about her legacy and her methods. She was effective, but she was also controversial. She helped win the war, but she did so in ways that made people uncomfortable. Yet the fact remains that Betty Pack made extraordinary contributions to the Allied victory in World War II. Without the Polish intelligence about Enigma that she helped obtain, British codebreakers might never have cracked the German military codes. Without the Italian naval codes she stole, The Royal Navy might have lost the Battle of Cape Matapan without the Vichy code she obtained in that daring operation at the embassy in Washington. Operation Torch might have failed or been far more costly in Allied lives. These are significant, consequential contributions. They mattered. They changed outcomes. They saved lives. Betty Pack deserves to be remembered, not as a scandal or a curiosity, not as a sexual adventurer or a femme fatale, but as what she actually was, a dedicated, skillful, courageous intelligence operative who served her country in the Allied cause with remarkable effectiveness during the most consequential conflict of the 20th century. She used the tools available to her, operated under extraordinary pressure, took enormous risks, and succeeded beyond what anyone could reasonably have expected. That is her real legacy, and it is a legacy worth honoring and remembering.